Good evening, everybody. Welcome back to the show. Thank you so much for joining me once again, as ever. And apologies, first off, for not being here for the last couple of weeks. It was down to technology. I was on the road, travelling. I think the first week I was in Ireland, so I was actually in the air on an aeroplane at the time. We normally go live then, but last week it was down to Wi-Fi in a hotel, just not being good enough. But anyway, you don't want excuses. We're here now, and so are you. So thank you very much again. There is a lot to talk about, isn't there? Because we haven't really seen each other since the F1 tests. So we'll cover loads of the stories from that, whatever you want to talk about. I've got a number of questions from you guys already, so thank you for those. Anyone who sent those in, I appreciate you all. Thanks to everybody who has sent me messages around the podcast. If you haven't heard my podcast yet, the Pit Lane Life Lessons podcast, check it out. Just search Pit Lane Life Lessons podcast wherever you get your podcast from, or check out my Instagram stories. I'd appreciate that, and feedback is always really good. I've got to say a big thank you to the guys at Lived 9 Lives Customs who sent me this brilliant t-shirt today, which I'm wearing despite it being freezing in this building site of a house. So thank you. I appreciate you sending that down to me. Appreciate it a lot. The building site hasn't moved on an awful lot, except for, you might be able to see back down the back there, we've got windows in, which is a big step forward because there haven't been any for months. So there we go, we're moving forward. But let's talk about Formula One. One of the biggest questions that's come from so many of you has been around this porpoising effect of the F1 cars. We will go wherever you want to go tonight, so just fire in your questions. But let's start there, because I know lots of you want to know the answers to this. The porpoising effect, I'm sure many of you already have seen it, many of you know what it is, but lots of questions around what the solutions might be to it. Can it be fixed? How can it be fixed? And what will be the knock-on effects of that? So the answer to this really is that, yes, of course, it can be overcome. The porpoising effect is this idea that as the car squashes down under load and becomes closer and closer to the racetrack, and therefore accelerates the airflow underneath, you get more and more downforce from the ground effect sucking the car down onto the floor. So it pulls the car down. Then at some point, the car gets pulled down so far that it either bottoms out and touches the floor, or just pulls down to such a level that the airflow stalls, i.e. you can't get under the car quickly enough and stalls. And in that moment, in that split second, the car essentially loses all of that underfloor downforce that it's been building up as it's travelling at speed along the straight. When it loses the downforce, of course, it loses that suction down onto the tarmac, and the car pops back up again. And as the car pops back up again and the gap between the floor of the car and the racetrack opens up, of course, the airflow starts flowing again, and you start to repeat the cycle. The downforce is generated, you build up speed, it sucks the car back down again until it stalls, and then it releases the downforce and up it goes. And so you get this phenomenon where the car almost looks like it's bouncing down the straight quite violently. If you saw the video of Charles Leclerc in his Ferrari, that was one of the most extreme examples that I saw over the testing week. But that's the phenomenon. So how can it be overcome? Well, there are a lot of different ways to attack this. It's partly because we've got so much of this underfloor downforce occurring now with the new design of the cars, partly because we have much stiffer suspension this year on the cars to cope with the different setup in terms of tyres. You think about the old days, as we can call them now, we had great big squashy balloon-like tyres on the car, which actually formed an awful lot of the car's compliance as it went over bumps and curbs and that kind of thing. Well, we haven't got that now. We've got a much more lower profile tyre, which is a stiffer sidewall, and therefore we need stiffer suspension to be able to manage A, the extra loads that are going through the car from an aero perspective, and B, that compliance from the car that was being taken up by the tyre is now having to be controlled via the car suspension. So I've mentioned this many times before. The engineers kind of love that because that effect has now come under their control. You can design and you can control that effect using the various settings and the adjustments on your suspension. So they love that. But of course, one of the effects is it has to be stiffer. And that's why we get this much more exaggerated bouncing effect. So to overcome it, there's a number of things. You can obviously dial that out with suspension. You can limit how far the car will drop down. So you can put things like bump stops and damper packers to limit how far the car will physically squash down. The problem with all this, right, is that it's all a compromise to performance, because the maximum amount of downforce that is generated is when the car is running at its highest speeds, of course, and it's at its lowest level. The underfloor downforce that's generated creates less drag than an equivalent amount of downforce that's generated by the wings that we've used in the past for much of the downforce production. So we don't have quite the same drag penalty for running at speed and generating this downforce that we would have had in previous years. So there's not such a compromise in that sense. But the teams don't want to compromise the setup of the car too much because they want the car squashing down low. It creates more performance, essentially. So to eliminate the porpoising effect, and some cars are suffering with it more than others, they have to compromise on their performance setup. Now, no Formula One team ever wants to compromise when it comes to performance. So there's going to be a very fine balancing act between teams dialing out performance. This is very general speaking here, but dialing out performance to eliminate the porpoising effect. And as I say, some teams will have to compromise more than others, perhaps because of their design, the way their floors work, the way that the aero works on that particular car, the way their suspension systems are set up. So we're going to see different effects on different cars and therefore different solutions. Lots of people have said, okay, what about, and I think even George Russell mentioned this, what about active suspension? Could we bring active suspension back to prevent this kind of effect from happening? And the answer to that is absolutely, of course we could. Yes, absolutely. I'd actually love to see it. I think it's a technology that has value for more than just Formula One. Developing those kind of systems, I mean, look, many road cars already have different forms of active suspension. So we know the technology is available, it's there, we know it works, we know how it works, and actually we could advance that massively in the world of Formula One. And of course, just with a flick of a switch or a couple of lines of code, we could dial out any of these kind of issues. It's not something you can just bring in overnight. We can't have it for this season, of course, because it takes an awful lot of development to make it work and to make it work safely. But in the future, that is potentially not just a solution to this problem, but something, a technology that I see having a future in the sport. Now that we have got things like a cost cap in place, it's not going to mean spiralling costs that are going to run out of control because we've already got that limited through the financial regulations. So why not bring back a technology like that that teams, if they want to, can choose to put a proportion of their budget in, generate performance, improve this kind of situation with porpoising, and potentially develop tools and systems that might have some sort of value outside of the sport. I think it's a great idea personally. So let's see what you guys are saying quickly before we move on from this one. Does it exist an automatic flap to stop the porpoising issue? No, it doesn't, David. I mean, that would essentially constitute active aerodynamics. So at the moment, we're not allowed to have something like that in the regulations. Active suspension, yes, lots of you suggesting active suspension. It is a great idea. Like I said, it's a great technology, but it isn't something we can just introduce overnight. There are things that the FIA, if they saw it as such a big problem, could do. They could introduce regulations that would allow certain relatively easy fixes to be brought in on the cars. However, some teams are not going to be suffering with this as a particular problem, and so they're not going to really want to see some kind of technology brought in that might help another team overcome a problem that they've got that one team's not really suffering with. And to bring something in like this at this stage, unless they deemed it massively to be on safety grounds, does need the unanimous support of all the teams at this late stage to, you know, the regulations are already set for this year, of course. So it's highly unlikely we're going to see a reg change. Excuse me. And actually what it's going to come down to is teams just having to find a compromise in their setup and their technology to minimise the effect and still maximise performance. All doable, it just might mean that they have to dial back a little bit on their outright ultimate performance levels. Also, by the way, this idea of stalling the floor, and apologies, I didn't see who sent the question, but somebody sent this in earlier. The idea of stalling the floor, which is at the very heart of the porpoising problem, is something that actually might be something that teams are working on if they can do it safely without the porpoising effect. Stalling the floor, I mean, like we've seen in the past with teams trying to stall rear wings at speed when you're coming down the straight, when you don't need the downforce but you want to dump the drag, there is, of course, some benefit to being able to stall the floor at speed. Now, as I said, the underfloor aerodynamics doesn't produce the same level of drag penalty than other forms of downforce production like wings do give off, but still there'd be an advantage if you could do that. And so dropping the car down to a level at speed that might stall this underfloor will be something the teams are all working on behind the scenes. How can you do it? How can you do it safely? How can you do it repeatedly so that it's a consistent phenomenon and not something that is hugely affected over a bump, like we get from the porpoising effect? So there's lots of work like this going on in the background because it's such a new set of features of these Formula One cars. It also opens up opportunities for stuff like that. So expect people to be thinking about and working on some clever solutions, a bit like we saw Mercedes with their collapsible rear suspension. We've seen flexible wings to certain degrees in the past. We've seen all sorts of different types of solutions to try and stall aerodynamics at the higher speeds when you don't want the downforce and you want to reduce the drag penalty. This will all be happening in the background right now because we've got a whole new aerodynamic platform to learn and develop some of those tricks on. Right, hello to everybody saying hello. I do appreciate you all. I just haven't got time to say hello to everybody, but thank you. Chris A. First of all, Chris A, thank you for all your questions. Hopefully I've answered a couple of them already earlier. I did get them. Says Marc's running late. His wife is just telling him off for another balaclava stunt. So if you've seen that video on my channel, you'll know what he's talking about. If you haven't, I strongly suggest you go and have a look. Right. Can you please share your thoughts on engine freeze that is going to be in place? I don't know if I have too many thoughts on the engine freeze. The engine freeze is there mostly because we are now at a stage in the current power plant situation where they've been in play for a number of years now. We are kind of converging pretty much in terms of performance levels between the manufacturers, give or take a little bit. They are much closer than they have been over previous years. The engine freeze is there to take away the focus from that area of car development because we've got brand new cars. So there's going to be much more focus needed on aero and suspension systems and the other elements of the new F1 car. The engine is just the same. And so we don't really want to or need to be focusing more and more money and attention on the engine. So they are going to be frozen. It's something that I think everybody agreed with because there's been so much money ploughed into them so far. And that allows everybody in the background to start thinking a little bit about the next generation of power units, which are being heavily talked about at the moment, coming in starting in 2026. There's an awful lot of work and development that has to go into those many years before we ever see them on a racetrack. And so over the next couple of years, that is exactly what will be happening in the background. Manufacturers starting to work more and more intensely on those designs, and that's where the budget should and rightly should go rather than the current power plant. So I don't have major any disagreement with it. I think it's a sensible move, and so seemingly do most other people. Have you heard about some teams struggling with minimum weight issues? Look, we hear these kind of things every year, partly because we've got brand new chassis. We have brand new chassis every year, but we've got a completely new, not just designs, but even philosophies based on those designs. And therefore we have things like people struggling to pass crash tests. And the only way typically you try and get yourself through a crash test if you've struggled is by putting more weight into the car. The cars are a lot heavier this year anyway, with the bigger wheels and tyres and various other things like the way the fuel cell's mounted in the car has added complexity and weight to the chassis design. So the cars are a lot heavier. Even so, given that, there are one or two teams, or at least rumours, and I have no inside track on this, but there are rumours that some teams are struggling to get it down to a minimum weight. We'll have to see. That may improve as time goes on, because sometimes, especially as you've got a deadline like pre-season testing, you have to just get the car running past its crash tests and onto a racetrack. And sometimes that can be done by compromising in certain areas where you might otherwise be really honing your development to lose weight. So that can still happen now that the cars have had their first week or so of week of testing. So it's not that we can't lose some of that weight potentially as time rolls on, but at the moment it may be a case that some teams are struggling. Where was that? I just saw a McLaren question there. 1 second. No, it's gone. Sorry. Okay, will Andretti come in? Says Ashutosh Dave. Well, it's looking likely that Andretti are putting together a serious bid. I don't know if you saw Will Buxton's tweets at the weekend. He was out in the States at the IndyCar race and had seemingly been talking to a lot of those guys involved in that project. And it seems very serious from what he was saying. And I have no other information other than that, but it seems very serious. There's a substantial penalty. I think it's 150 million, is it, that the team have to pay to the other Formula One teams collectively as an entry fee to come into the sport if they were to do so. The alternative, of course, is to come in having bought an existing entry. And the most obvious one of those would seemingly be the Haas operation, wouldn't it? An operation, and this will link into many of your other questions, so I'm not ignoring the questions about Haas and the Mazepin connection and all of that stuff. We'll get onto that. But off the back of all of this stuff that's happening around Russia and Ukraine and the impact or the connection that they have as a team to Russian oligarchs and the controversy around all of that right now, there is a scenario that could play out here where they lose that investment. And that investment, let's put it quite frankly, is keeping that team afloat and alive. Look, let's be really blunt. Nikita Mazepin, we all know, is there, not based solely on talent, but based largely on the funding that his father brings to the team through the title sponsorship of his dad's company. Now, if that were to suddenly disappear, that's a significant blow. I mean, that's a death blow, potentially, for the Haas Formula One team. Now, if that happened, and that is not something beyond the realms of possibility, given everything that's going on right now in the world, if that were to happen, then that would leave the Haas Formula One team almost floundering without money, potentially without money to continue, and in a situation that is ripe for picking for somebody like the Andretti team who might want to come along and either join forces in the beginning, i.e. bail them out financially and get them back onto the grid and keep them going, with a view to potentially taking over the team. I don't think that's a scenario that's beyond the realms of possibility. So that would both save Andretti the 150 million or whatever it is entry fee for coming in as an additional team. It would also get around the complexities of having an additional team on the grid in terms of logistics, garage space at some circuits, everything that comes along with that, the share of prize money and all the other complexities. If they took over an existing entry, that would actually be a lot simpler for everybody in terms of those involved in the sport. So that's something to keep an eye on. That is a space that you need to keep watching because things are changing on a daily basis. I have no doubt that those kind of conversations are already happening behind the scenes. The Haas team is precarious at the best of times and it has been bailed out by this Russian money. So they are kind of tiptoeing around right now, not really knowing where their future lies. And you've got to feel a little bit for them. Yes, they may well have made some poor decisions, but they've been desperate. They've been desperate in terms of not being able to survive in this sport. And so when someone comes along with money, perhaps they've taken a wrong decision in going with the directions that they've been in. And actually you could look back to their previous title sponsor catastrophe before that with a certain energy drink brand. How disastrous that was. Perhaps you just got to put the blame squarely at the Haas Formula One team's door and say they are making poor decisions when it comes to bringing in funding for the team. There's no one else to blame for that, really. They may have had some bad luck, but they've clearly made some poor decisions. But those are the sorts of things you do when you are desperate. And I think that is the problem. The Haas Formula One team are precarious, desperately precarious from a financial perspective. So keep an eye on that. That's a changing scenario, as I say, daily, and anything could happen, including Andretti finding themselves in Formula One much sooner than we might have imagined. Right. is there news about Volkswagen Group to get into Formula One? Well, it does look more and more likely that, VW, Porsche, Audi, that whole group, particularly I think in the early part through Porsche, potentially joining forces with Red Bull. And that might be an announcement that comes very soon, in fact, much sooner than many would imagine. I think that's a deal that seemingly behind the scenes might be done, just be waiting for some kind of approval from a VW perspective or a VAG perspective from the very top brass there. But it sounds like they are very advanced in those discussions. And actually, if you read between the lines, may have been pretty advanced in those discussions for quite a long time now. Maybe even before we really thought things were getting serious. So that's something I think could be announced very soon. And then we've got this other potential tie-up between Audi and McLaren. There were some stories that broke towards the tail end of last year, even suggesting by some journalists that Audi had even bought the McLaren organisation, or at least the Formula One team. Those were quickly denied by the McLaren organisation, but it was never denied that talks were ongoing. And I think most people seem to think those are talks that have clearly happened, maybe still happening, and could still have a potential future. The VAG, the Volkswagen Audi group, I think, and it seems like, have ideas of getting into Formula One in quite a big way. Not just with one brand, but potentially with two of their brands coming in with separate teams. And who knows what level of involvement. With Red Bull, potentially it's just an engine partnership. Possibly with McLaren, it could be something bigger. Who knows? We are speculating at this point, but I think we're going to definitely see a presence from VAG coming to the sport in the very near future. So keep an eye on that. Let's see. McLaren look pretty strong. They seem to have less porpoising issues compared to others. Could you see them challenging at the front this season, says iQuantum. Look, they are on a trajectory which is heading in the right direction and has been for a few years now. There have been some management changes behind the scenes, internally within the team, which I think all seem very sensible. I know many of the people involved, and I think they are good, potentially good moves. So I think internally things are good. People are happier, people are working in the right way and working towards the right direction. The team feels good on many, many levels, which it hasn't done for quite a few years, I could say, on a bigger perspective. In terms of their car, they seem to run reliably at the test, which is always a good sign. And, I think whilst we can pretty much ignore lap times, the feeling coming out of the team seems positive, and that's the sort of thing you need to be looking for at this stage of the season. Ignore the lap times. If you have listened to my podcast that went live this morning, I talk exactly about this, what we can learn from the pre-season tests, and perhaps more importantly, what wasn't said or what wasn't put on display. What can we see and what can we learn when we look around the edges of things like the lap times and the interview statements that are released by teams, the press releases, all that official stuff. That doesn't give very much away in pre-season testing deliberately. So what can you find out when you look around the edges of all that? Look in the background and look at people's body language and the state of the garage and the mood in the garage. And if I look at McLaren, to be honest, that feels quite good right now. And that's generally a positive sign. So yeah, there's no reason that we can't expect McLaren to continue their upwards trajectory and potentially have a really strong season. Who knows what the pecking order is going to be? I would still expect the big teams to be the big teams. And I had somebody message me, I think it was on YouTube the other day, saying, I'm really disappointed. It looks like these new regulations haven't done much in terms of shaking up the order. It still looks like the big teams are going to be the big teams. And my answer was, well, that doesn't mean the regulations have failed, because actually the regulations were never designed to shake up the order. They weren't there to randomise things. They were there to close up the field and potentially give the opportunity for overtaking and closer wheel-to-wheel racing. Of course, the big teams with the best people, the best resources and facilities, they're always going to have the advantage, particularly in the early phase of this regulation change. What this does do is give an opportunity for a slightly smaller team, or a team that might not have been traditionally top 3 or 4, to do a much better job than some others and exploit a loophole or find a solution that others haven't found And that could be enough to just catapult them up the order a bit. So we might see some changes in the order, but I still expect the big teams to be the big teams. So the Mercedes of this world, the Red Bulls of this world, potentially Ferrari joining that group. That would be great from a sporting perspective. And look, McLaren are on the fringes of that as well. So there's nothing to say they couldn't step up and join that party. If not for an entire season, like they did last year, on a sporadic basis. And if they can build on that, because this season is going to be about where you start and how quickly you can build on it. How quickly you can develop your platform and what sort of basis you have to develop from, but then how quickly you can develop over the season whilst maintaining this budget cap and under the various aero restrictions in terms of development from wind tunnel and CFD. So there's a lot of different things at play this season, but if you can build from a great starting point and then develop quickly this season, you've got a great chance of outperforming others who might be struggling with their early base designs and take longer to get to their optimum performance level. That's what a great big regulation change like this offers. Right. Okay. Do you think the spoilers or mini wings are useful around the rear exhaust outlet? Okay. Well, the first thing is that they wouldn't be on the car if they weren't useful. By the time anything is actually made in a physical form and placed on a Formula One car on a racetrack, you can pretty much guarantee it's been proven in both the wind tunnel and the CFD simulation software to offer an advantage in some way. Whether, that advantage plays out in reality to the same degree you thought it would from your simulation tools is another story, and that's why they go testing, but it's on there for a reason. So absolutely, look, there's these sort of beam wings, the lower part of the rear wing, which in the past was just a fairly neutral section and didn't do much in the way of offering downforce generation. Now, because of the way the underfloors work and the diffuser works and the way we can flow airflow over the top of the diffusers in a much more sculpted way than before, the beam wings, the lower beam wings, can have a really big impact on drawing airflow or directing airflow up and out of the back of the diffuser and helping that process. And therefore, of course, generating more of that underfloor downforce as a result. So they're having a bit more of an impact. They've become more of a feature, and I think it'll be an area of development as we move over the course of the season. We're going to see development shifting, of course, aren't we, with the brand new cars. In the last couple of years, it was all about barge boards and deflectors around the front of the side pods, behind the front wheels. They were a really key part. Of course, front wings were another huge part of it as well. Floors, the floor outer edges, particularly with the higher rate cars, became critically important. And look, some of those areas will continue to be important, but of course barge boards are gone. So there's going to be a lot of work around the leading edge of the underfloor, so underneath the side pod itself, critical now, much more so, to do some of the job that the barge boards were doing. We've still got to try as best we can to eject that turbulent tyre weight coming off the front tyres, but we don't any longer have the barge boards to do that. We don't have the front wing end plates in the same way to do that job that we used to have. We don't have airflow blowing through the front axle or through the front wheels to be able to drag away that messy turbulent weight like we used to have either. So many of those tools are gone, but we've still got to find ways to have that same effect, essentially, because we don't want the tyre wake coming along the side of the car and messing up the critical underfloor aerodynamics now. So now we're using things like the leading edge of the side pod. That's why you're seeing some of these big flat surfaces on the front of the side pod, which look so unaerodynamic, almost like a brick wall. And whilst they obviously create some kind of drag penalty, they're also having this impact of forcing the airflow out and away from the car and just taking up some of that effect that the barge boards and all those other tools that I talked about would have had in the past that are no longer available to us. So we're still trying to accomplish the same things, more or less, that we've always had to deal with in terms of tyre wake, but now we're having to try and find new ways to do it. And the regulations, of course, are designed to try and stop us doing that. The F1 engineers are trying to find ways to navigate around the regulations and still have that same effect that we had before in forcing the tyre wake out and away from the car so that it minimises the effect on the rest of the car's aerodynamics. So it's a constant battle between regulators and F1 engineers, but that's how it's always been. Thoughts on Ferrari's side pods? I mean, I love the fact that they are so different. It's a really interesting design. Same thing, really. They are on there because Ferrari have found that they give a positive effect. And, you know, that's the only reason they're there. They're not there because they look weird. They're not there because they look good. There's no style impact. There's no points for style here. This is because they see an aerodynamic benefit. So what they're trying to do in that heavily sculpted top of the side pod, of course, is to drag the airflow neatly in around the edge of the engine cover and feed it into the back of the floor above the top of the diffuser for that similar effect, to generate more downforce and increase the impact that the underfloor has. So everyone's trying to do that in different ways. You know, remember a few years ago everyone was talking about the Coanda effect, in terms of that effect where airflow sticks to the surface or follows the contours of a curved surface, in our case of bodywork. We've always utilised that in different ways, not quite to the extreme effects we had in the past where exhausts were blowing along the side pods, but we're going to start to use that more and more again. And we are using it more and more again because, we're trying to feed as much airflow into that, almost like the Coke bottle section or above the rear of the floor, because the underfloor now has become an even greater part of the car's overall aerodynamic performance. What do you think of the new Aero and wet races? Could something like Spa have worked with the spray going up rather than straight back? I think I'm reserving judgment on what the effect will be in the wet, because I think we've all seen pictures doing the rounds from last week where we saw the spray off the back of the car. The spray is clearly having a different trajectory out the back of the car. It's going up in a much more vertical sense than it has in the past, which was the actual theory behind this, of course, because the wake out the back of the car is equally dragged up high into the air, allowing the car behind to follow much more closely, which, by the way, it seems to have done. Lots of comments from drivers saying it is easier to follow through corners without losing anywhere near the amount of downforce they would have lost in the past. So that's great. That seems like a win. But what happens to that spray? Because obviously the spray is going up with the airflow, with the wake out the back of the car. It's going up high and into the air. But what that doesn't necessarily leave is just a pocket of emptiness where there's no rainfall and no spray. So I don't know quite what visibility is going to be like in that sense if you are following. I don't know if it's suddenly going to be better. In terms of a turbulent wake from the back of the car, yes, it gets ejected high into the air and you leave a pocket of relatively clean air. But that's not the same for rain. You don't leave a pocket where there's no rain or there's no mist. So the mist is there, it's just in the air all around us at that point. So I don't quite know how that's going to work. We'll have to reserve judgment on that one. I didn't really see any driver comments off the back of that in the wet sessions. So I don't know. Don't know what the effect is going to be, but it will be different. And I think we'll have to kind of make judgment calls on that when we finally get that situation in a race environment. Do you think the field spread will be smaller under the new regs due to the restrictions in place? If not immediately, within the next season or so, says Ali H. I do. I think the changes that we're making to the sport as a whole this year are mostly sensible ones. In fact, I think they're all sensible ones. The theory behind them all is great. I think it's the most sensible set of regulation changes as a whole, probably that we've ever made in Formula One. Now that comes partly because the team that have made those changes at Formula One themselves, led by Ross Brawn, of course, are a lot of them now ex-Formula One engineers. The likes of Pat Simmons, the likes of Rob Smedley, the likes of Ross Brawn himself. We've never really had that situation in the past. But also, the actual F1 teams have been much more heavily involved in the forming of these regulations. And so we've had some of the best minds, the best brains, working towards a common solution, which was to improve racing in terms of the on-track racing and to close up the spread of the entire field over the course of a race and a season. And we're doing that both through technical means, through sporting regulation changes, and through financial regulation changes too. It all seems to make sense. So I see no reason why it won't have the effect that we expect it to have. The financial implications are probably one of the most stark. They are going to have a dramatic impact, particularly on the bigger teams that were just running away and able to outspend the smaller teams by 3 or 4 or more times. That's gone. Overnight, that's gone. And so, yes, they will still have an advantage because they've got great facilities and everything else that are already in place. They've got great people and all those things. And they should have an advantage. They're the best teams. The best teams should have an advantage. They've built that advantage over years, and that should be an advantage to them that still exists. It's just that we want the advantage to be less and less reliant on just having more money to throw at problems. And so, absolutely, I think we'll have an impact immediately, but the greater impact will happen over the next 2, 3, 4 years. And in that time, we really should see the field close up, together with the Aero development restrictions that are in place as well. I think they're all really good and sensible ideas, and I'm really looking forward to seeing what impact it has in the longer term. Mark, are you on the set of The Money Pit? No, I'm not. No, I'm just in my partly renovated house. Right. Hold on. Do drivers lift off to help hide true performance of the cars from other teams? This I also covered in the podcast, I think, as well. Sandbagging, as many people call it, the idea of running your car heavy, either over-fueled or with extra ballast on, just to slow it down and hide. If you think you've got incredible performance that you don't want others to see at this stage, people can, in theory, run the car heavy, run the car with extra ballast or extra fuel, and that's legitimate. That happens. There's nothing stopping anyone doing it. In my mind and in my view, it happens incredibly rarely. Even more so in today's environment where we're so limited on how much actual real-world testing every team and driver has available to them. There isn't really time. You've got to be very, very confident in your car to want to start wasting days or wasting opportunities in limit what you're able to test because you want to run at a reduced or restricted performance level. So yes, you can do it. And yes, in terms of the second test, you might well see teams backing off before the line just so that you don't get a real headline lap time that starts triggering people to sit up and take much more notice of you. That's a thing that can happen. So you run the entire lap at full pace, but then just before the end you lift off. It doesn't really hide anything from the teams because the teams are watching you all the way around that lap. They have got people analysing every segment of that racetrack that you go around. So you're not really hiding anything from the other teams. It's just more so hiding it from the media, who really only take in the most part notice of the actual lap time. That's the only thing that tends to get judged from the outside. Whereas, as I said in the podcast, that is the most inconsequential part of what happens on this first Formula One test last week. The lap time is almost irrelevant for most people because you don't know what they're doing, what their program is, what sort of level the car is running at, what kind of fuel loads, obviously, engine settings. You don't know anything about what they're trying to achieve. And almost always, they're not trying to achieve the ultimate lap time in the first week of the test. It's about proving components, putting mileage on, testing different systems on the car, running through performance sweeps in terms of things like aero sweeps, different wing angles, suspension settings, seeing how the car responds to all those changes. It's that kind of thing that is the focus for almost everybody, particularly in the first week of a test. Yeah, next time when we go to Bahrain for the second test, of course the focus will start to switch more towards performance as we get closer and closer to the start of the season. But in the first test, there's no point in analysing lap times, and it makes me laugh, and it always made me laugh, even when I was in the team, that the media and of course fans off the back of that get so excited and so analytical about the lap time of any particular car. So I forgot where that question started, but apologies, I rambled on massively, but I hope that was still interesting. Beer o'clock. It's not quite beer o'clock, is it? Got 20 minutes yet, and I've left my beer out the back, which I'll have to go and get. So yes, it is getting close to it. Do you have your motorbike licence? Says Richard Putman. Random question on a show like this, but yes, I do, Richard. Thank you. Love a motorbike. Haven't got one at the moment. Would desperately love to have one at some point again. Which car do you think looked the best? For me, it was the Red Bull, says G. Thompson. Do you know what? This is another thing, and with the greatest respect, G. Thompson, I'm not taking the mickey out of you for asking that question, but it's another thing that I sort of chuckle at a little bit, because it doesn't matter what a car looks like. It really has no impact on its performance. A team does not design a car to look good, and actually a car can look completely ugly, but if it's the fastest car out there, everybody who's working in that team will be the happiest. So I can't look at anybody and say that car looked the best. And I'm not just talking about aesthetically. Obviously, we don't really care in the most part from a performance perspective what a car looks like. But if you're asking me which one looked best from a performance perspective, I can't judge that either for all the reasons that I just said earlier. We have no idea what anyone was doing across the week of the first test. And with the insight that I have from being inside the team, I'm even less likely to try and judge performance off the back of what we saw. We can judge to some level reliability just through the amount of laps that people did. But even that is, subjective, because we don't know how hard anybody was pushing in those first few days. When you push your car harder, you can introduce more complications from a reliability perspective. When we go to Bahrain, we'll be running in much higher temperatures. Equally, can start to introduce potential problems that you would never have seen in the first week at Barcelona. So it's way too early really to judge performance level of anybody at this stage. And that's why I said in the podcast today, if you really want to gain a little bit more insight, don't look at lap times. Don't really even look too much at what the cars look like on track. Look at what the drivers are saying, what the team principals are saying, not the stock answer. What are they saying around that? What's their body language saying? What are the team around them, the team behind them saying? And what's the mood and the atmosphere in the garage looking like? What are the specifics? If they're talking about problems, are they talking about specific problems, or are they being more general and vague, like we just need to do a bit more work, we're not quite there yet, good basis. If it's those real generic answers, you can start to read a little bit more into that. If they start quoting specific problems, well, perhaps those problems are much more real and much more of an issue that they've been compelled to bring it up in an interview. So there's a lot of stuff you can learn from those first few days, but looking at a car and certainly looking at a lap time is probably not one of them. You are pushing it. Craig Cole, purely superficially, which car's livery do you like the best? Which car's livery? I mean, again, I'm not one of these to really get excited about liveries. I get excited about performance when we finally get to see it, and not much more than that. The liveries, I don't know. I mean, I quite like the Ferrari, the red and black of the Ferrari, to be honest. It's quite old school Ferrari. It reminds me of some earlier, more successful Ferrari cars that we've had than we've had in recent years. So I quite like the look of that car. But yeah, the livery is something that is meaningless when it comes to performance. And from an engineering perspective, which is obviously where I come from, I'm kind of all about the performance rather than the way that it looks. So I'm sorry if that's a rubbish answer, but that's the one you're getting. I mean, you tell me, what are your favourite liveries? What are your favourite looking cars? If anyone's got, there we go, McLaren F1 race says the Alpha. In fact, the Alpha looks quite cool. We finally got to see that, didn't we? I actually quite like the camo liveries that we occasionally get. But there we go. Yes, a few of you saying Alpha looks good. So there you go. Can Williams climb into the midfield? Another good question, and I think yes they can. I actually think, and I don't know, I haven't really heard or seen anything coming out of Williams at this point, so I don't know what they did in the first test or how well they were, how well they thought things went. But look, they're a team that, again, a little bit like McLaren, behind the scenes and internally, have been steadily building. And no, we haven't seen a dramatic turnaround in performance, but I think they've been climbing gradually, and more importantly than that, they've been putting pieces in place inside that team to start heading things back in the right direction. Started with the takeover that brought in financial stability. That's a huge thing in a Formula One team. Jos Capito coming in, I've mentioned this before, I think is a massive asset to any Formula One team. And he's there, and it'll take him some time, but he's of course now starting to put the pieces in place, and they will start to see the effects of all of that happening over the next 12 months. So if they've done a good job, and that's a big if, but that's the same big if that everybody will have hanging over them at the start of this season with such a massive change in terms of technical regs. If they've done a good job, I think they've got enough opportunity and enough good people to start climbing up the ladder just a little bit. So yeah, I've got high hopes for Williams. I think if it's not this year, over the next couple of years, I really expect them to start climbing and building their way back gradually towards the kind of success that we would love to see them all have, I think, at that team. Right, so lots of you, okay, like the Alpine one, says Simon Steele. Blue and pink is like the Monotone Onyx, okay. Love the new Ferrari, says Aero X, yeah. MJ Razor loves the McLaren. Here's a good one. George Alimo, will those wheel covers be tricky at pit stops? I feel like they will be trickier than they used to be in the past, but they're not going to be tricky because the teams will figure out the best way to get the wheels on and off quickly. We've had wheel covers in the past. Back in my day, we even trialled, if you remember, we had wheel covers. Slightly different, of course, back then, but it's not going to be something that's going to stop pit stops happening in blisteringly quick times. I think they'll be slower anyway because everything's just bigger, it's heavier, and you've got the wheel cover in the way as well. Plus you've got the over the top, the little Aero wheel cover, as well as the cover on the face of the wheel. So there are some differences. Of course they're going to have an impact. The biggest impact probably is going to be the big size and weight increase in terms of those wheels. Just physics will naturally slow that down. So we probably will see slightly slower pit stops. Almost certainly we'll see slightly slower pit stops. But gradually the teams will figure out ways to fine tune, as they always do, hone that process, and we'll get something, I'm sure, that is still pretty spectacular, because that's what we always get with Formula One. Yeah, heavy wheels might be tricky, says Rob Graham. Absolutely right. The Alpine looks very good. G. Thompson. Front wheel wings are a bit ridiculous. Well, what are they ridiculous? On what grounds are they ridiculous? McLaren F1 race. They are there, of course, for a reason. Again, to try and control that tyre wake. It's all being done for good, sensible reasons. You can't see the aero effect that those pieces have, but they're there for a good reason. I can see a scenario where they might get broken in a pit stop, where you're slamming a new wheel on, and if it doesn't quite go on straight, potentially, you know, one of those wheel covers, winglet things, whatever we want to call them, could potentially get broken in a pit stop. I wouldn't say that was beyond the realms of possibility. But you know, they're not ridiculous because they are serving a sensible purpose. If they look ridiculous, I mean, that is up to you. That is an aesthetic thing. Do you reckon we'll see LED advertising on the wheel covers this year or next? Look, we know the technology is there, it exists. We've seen it on cars in the past. The big question mark will be what it's for, what we're going to use it for. Because the teams won't run it voluntarily just for a marketing perspective, because there'll be a weight penalty, of course, with it. And no one can, I mean, almost nobody can justify an additional weight penalty for some kind of marketing gain, which I suspect would be minimal in that sense. What we might see, though, is the FIA or Formula One mandating it, and that's not beyond the realms of possibility at all. That could easily happen. Relatively easy thing to implement. If it happened to everybody, there's no advantage or disadvantage. But then there's a question of what you show on it. Do you show, I mean, if F1 are mandating it, it's unlikely that it's going to be to show sponsors, but it could be to show something like the position that the car is in during a Grand Prix. It could be something like the, I don't know, whether it's moved up one or two places from its starting position or moved down. There could be a system of LEDs that communicate some basic information which might be, you know, interesting or useful for fans to be able to see in real time as the cars are going around the track in a different way. So there are a number of uses for it. I think it has value somewhere and it is interesting. But whether we'll see it this year or next, I mean, I don't really know. It's more of a decision based on the fan experience, I think, more than anything else. So it's very subjective, and it would have to get implemented to everybody, I suspect. But there's nothing stopping it happening. So we'll have to wait and see. All right. Oh, that was a good one. Where's that gone? You've mentioned teams moving up the grid, but that means others will be moving backwards. So which teams, in your opinion, will go backwards? Glenn Veazey. Again, it's just impossible to judge who's done a good job and who hasn't done a good job this year. The only thing I keep coming back to is I would expect the big teams to still be towards the front. Whether that order shuffles up slightly, I don't know. And the outlier there is that there could be somebody who has found something in terms of interpreting these regulations that could bring a significant performance increase and catapult them somewhere up the grid. There could be someone who's got it horribly wrong or played it too safe, for example. It's impossible to judge that right now. I'm not sitting on the fence. Well, I am sitting on the fence, but I'm sitting on the fence because there is no point in trying to guess at this stage who's done a good job and who hasn't. We can look at those cars and we can analyse it to death. We can say, look at the trick bit that the trick scoops on the top of the Ferrari side pod. We can say, look at the way that McLaren have detailed the outer edge of their floor. Brilliant ideas, perhaps. Look at the beam wing on the back of the Red Bull. Look at the side pod leading edge and the undercut. Could be all genius things, but they're only genius if they work in conjunction with everything else on that package and delivers an overall performance advantage from somebody else. If it doesn't do that, well, it's not that genius. So we just don't know. There's no point in us looking at something and saying, that looks brilliant, I like what they've done, this could be a good year for them. That's pointless conversation to have at this stage. The only thing we can start to judge really is when we start seeing pure out and out performance runs on the cars. We can look at what the drivers and the teams are saying behind the scenes around all of that, what kind of body language and what kind of atmosphere the team are giving off, and combine all of those things to start building up a picture. And even after that, things will change dramatically before we even get to the first Grand Prix. So I know that sounds like it's not the answer that you want. I know that. I'm sorry, Glenn Veazey. I'm sorry. I know you wanted something more categorical than that, but I can't give it. And quite frankly, nobody can. So wherever you read or see somebody deciding on a pecking order or deciding the people that seem to have done the best job, you can almost discount it at this stage. And I'm telling you that from experience of being inside one of the teams. Nobody knows what your team has done. And even the people inside a team, whilst they have a brilliant idea of what they've done, they know exactly what's going on with their car and their program. They don't even know what's going on with other people's programs. So in terms of a pecking order, it's still impossible to judge, even if you're inside one of those teams at this point. So I'm sorry, I can't give you any better than that. Paul C says, pull or push rod, which is better? This is going to be one of those nights where I'm really not trying to avoid answering your questions, but there's no right answer. There's no right or wrong answer in this situation. It's the same thing that I've just said there. One side pod design, although wildly different from another, could work brilliantly on one car because it's designed into the concept. The same that a completely different side pod design wouldn't work if you just swapped it over to that other car that wasn't designed with that concept. It's the same with pull or push rod. Generally, pull or push rod, of course it has some differences in terms of dynamics of how it all works, of how the suspension works as a result of that. It has an impact on weight distribution or centre of gravity. Pull rod can bring most of the suspension components down lower in the centre of the cockpit, in the centre of a chassis. So there's an advantage from a C of G perspective in that. But generally, most of the decision-making process when it comes to pull or push rod is centred around aero, because you're trying to clear a path for aero that's heading downstream towards things like your side pods or your floor leading edge. And so it depends what those designs are like as to whether you need to go pull or push rod. So there's so many factors that go into these designs. There is no right or wrong answer. There's no way I can answer a question that says, is pull or push rod better? Because it depends on how you've designed the rest of your car, whether it was designed around a push rod or designed around a pull rod, and whether you've got the entire package working. So I'm really not trying to sit on the fence, but there's no right answer. That's the thing. And that is the thing, right, with these Formula One cars. And that's why I say you can't look at them. And I haven't done my normal, analytical videos for all the cars this year that I do every year. And there's a couple of reasons why I haven't done that. One, I just haven't had time, and that's genuine. But secondly, this year more than ever, the cars that were launched were never going to be anywhere near the same cars that hit the racetrack. And that's been proved to be the case. I mean, the cars we saw actually lapping around Barcelona, in the most part, were nothing like the cars that most of the teams released to the world at their launch. So all the people that did analytical videos in minute detail around those launch cars, it's almost pointless. Not entirely pointless. And look, I've done them for years. There is value, there is interest in explaining some of the concepts on display. But when you're spending 15 minutes analysing a front wing on a launch car, I mean, I can tell you from experience, there is no way that wing is ever going anywhere near a racetrack. There's just no way. And this year more than ever. So I haven't done the videos, and I apologise if you've been looking for those and waiting for them. I'm disappointed in myself because I wanted to do them, and maybe if I get the chance, but I can't commit because I'm just so busy right now. I can't say I'll be able to do them. But this year was always going to be teams trying to hold back stuff, not releasing their hand to the world until the very last minute as best they could. And even at that point, things are going to be changing rapidly. The development cycle in this early phase of the season, particularly building up to the first race, is probably going to be more rapid than we've ever seen before. And that's given that we're under a budget cap. But it's going to be front loaded because now's the time to start figuring out the problems, the solutions to the challenges you're facing with a brand new car. And so much of that development budget is going to have to be front loaded in the season. And so we will see so many iterative changes in these next couple of weeks, and even in the first few races of the season as things start, being proven or disproven, as you come out the wind tunnel onto the racetrack, as you start seeing other people, develop their own cars and see which design philosophies they take. You'll be trying those in your own simulation tools and seeing if you have missed a trick. So there's going to be a lot of that change happening over the first couple of months. And so it's probably not a huge amount of point in really going too deep in terms of analysing individual concepts or components, because they won't be there for very long in the most part. Look, we've only got 3 minutes. Blimey, it's almost over. Okay, let's see if we can smash out one more. Lots of you really desperate to find out which bits of which cars I like. I like the car that will be fastest. How about that? Let's wait and see what that one is. Why, when they rolled the Red Bull into the garage during testing, did they have to crawl underneath it and put a cooling fan onto the floor? Never seen anyone else do it. I picked a wrong question there because I don't know the answer. I didn't see that happening, Anthony. Sorry. Let's see if I can squeeze in one more. You lot do make me laugh. Paul O'Donegal. Hey Paul. Paul is a mate of mine. I used to work with Paul. Thanks for watching, mate. What do you think the teams have done to combat the underfloor downforce from disengaging when going over the brow of a hill like Radeon? So look, this is all linked to the porpoising effect that I talked about earlier. And the answer is we don't know what they've done yet. There are a number of things they can do in terms of the porpoising effect, as I explained earlier, really comes from the floor stalling as it gets too low. I guess if you're talking about going over the brow of a hill, so you're talking about the opposite effect where it goes over the top of a hill and the gap really starts to open up because the car almost jumps over the top. Bump stops and things like that can really help with that. But as I said before, all of those details that want to overcome the extremes of any dynamic situation, like bumps, like curbs, like this stalling effect or the porpoising effect, anything that is at the extreme of a car's dynamic situation like that, if you have to fix a problem like that, you've got to compromise the most part of the car's performance range. So you want to trim the car to operate at its best across the widest part of its performance range. The outliers, like the car squashed against the racetrack and the stalling effect, or going over the brow of a hill or a big bump, they're the extreme ends. And yes, they happen, and yes, they can cause problems, but to overcome those, you've probably got to dial back the performance a little bit in the middle section of your performance span to compensate for the extreme outliers at either end of that range, if that makes sense. And that means teams compromising. Formula One teams don't like to compromise, and that's going to be the real balancing act that everyone's facing right now, or everyone's suffering. Not everyone's suffering to the same extent. But it's going to be about how much are you willing to compromise, and maybe you have to sort of tailor that and trim that depending on each circuit. And if you've got specifics like that, like a brow of a hill at a particular racetrack, maybe you have to compromise more at that particular circuit, or on a particularly bumpy circuit, or a particularly high-speed circuit. And that, I guess, will come through a lot of simulation work, a lot of testing in the Fridays of Grand Prix weekends, and we might see teams having to figure that out on the fly. I hope we don't see issues resulting from any of these potential problems that we're talking about here. And I hope they figure them out long before we get to a point of safety issues occurring. But my concern and my worry would be that when you ask a Formula One team to compromise on performance, because there's potentially a safety issue at the outlier, at the extreme end of their performance range, well, you're in that grey area where how much do you compromise because of the rest of your performance in the middle, and how much do you factor in that potential safety issue that might or might not happen at one or two occasions over the Grand Prix weekend. I hope we don't get into that, but look, that's what's going on in lots of Formula One teams right now, up and down the world, up and down the country and across Europe. We'll find out more as the next couple of weeks go on. And that, folks, is it. We've done an hour. It's really good to be back. I'm sorry I missed the last couple of weeks, but thank you very much for joining. I will, I think, be back next week. Yeah, I'll be back next week. Oh no, I won't be back next week. I don't think I can make next week. I might try and do Sunday night next week. Stand by, watch my socials, I'll let you know. Sorry, man. Guys, these are busy times right now. I'll do my best. But I appreciate you all. Check out the Pit Lane Life Lessons podcast if you haven't already. You can even listen to it on this YouTube channel if you want, or find it wherever you get your podcast from. Thanks for watching. Thanks for listening. Have a great week, folks. And I will see you all very, very soon. Ta-da!